HoneyBadgerRadio has talked about female violence lots of times. We've vehemently criticized feminists for ways they have perverted research to hide female perpetration and deny male victims relief and recourse from their abusers. We've discussed social attitudes and double standards that lead to people dismissing or outright ignoring female violence. In an early episode, we illustrated with an example. Picture two people waiting in a public place. Person A says something sexually explicit and degrading to person B. Offended, person B slaps person A. At the first statement, the people aren't gendered. How many people hearing that description automatically updated upon hearing the rest to picture the speaker as a man and the slapper as a woman in order to feel comfortable with the slap? This week on Twitter, we learned that the staff of Evie magazine would. The publication's official Twitter account posted their statement on the topic over the weekend.
Normalize slapping men in the face when they've crossed the line.
The account went on to try to draw a divide between that statement and any attempt at normalizing domestic violence by describing pretty much the same scenario I just did. While our original version used a bus stop, theirs used a bar. They engaged in exactly the failure I highlighted in that old opener. They failed to recognize physical violence as an escalation of the conflict they were describing when the violence was described as coming from an offended woman. When I responded to the stereotyping and bad logic of the argument by calling the magazine feminist, it was quickly pointed out to me that no, it's a tradcon, or traditionalist conservative publication. HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. Why do today's traditionalist conservative ladies spout victim narratives that sound exactly like the victim narratives feminists use? To answer that, I have to make a little correction as to who these people are. I can't call them tradcons, but instead use the term neo-tradcon because I was raised in a traditional Christian conservative family. And I was taught by my parents and my church that hitting another person in anger is always bullying, and it is childish and foolish to escalate a conflict from verbal abuse to violence in a situation where you can de-escalate by disengaging. Or, as my dad put it, be the bigger person and walk away. The adults in my family never would have accepted, "He said something disrespectful to me," as my excuse for slapping a guy who had not used physical aggression to prevent me from walking away from him. I'd have gotten a lecture about failing to control my temper. Under old-fashioned conservative values, learning to control one's temper is an important part of developing adult maturity for both sexes, often described as part of learning to be a lady or a gentleman, but at my house as part of learning to be strong. My parents described unnecessary aggression as weak behavior in both sexes. It's basically the non-aggression principle as explained to kids. Don't hit anybody if they haven't made hitting them the only way to stop them from hurting you. While exception is made for defending the defenseless when they're under wrongful attack, the non-aggression principle was always taught, even if not by name, as the child's primary guide to handling rudeness and verbal bullying. Kids were taught respect for others' bodily autonomy and integrity, accountability for the self, and mindfulness of the consequences of one's own actions, even when someone else's behavior is bad. That's the difference between old-fashioned traditionalist Christian conservative ladies and gentlemen and modern neo-tradcon ladies and gentlemen. The accountability factor. Boys do still grow up learning that mindfulness, and it's still reinforced by their adult mentors in the aftermath of their childhood fights. They're held accountable to avoid aggression, to judge the potential outcomes of aggression and not start fights they cannot win, and to be compassionate when faced with an aggressor who is much weaker or more vulnerable than themselves, like a little kid or a girl. Girls no longer grow up learning to be anywhere near as mindful of the consequences of their choices, even in neo-tradcon households. The feminist tendency of blaming the nearest and most involved guy when female choices result in regrettable consequences has infected the narrative. As I pointed out in an old blog post titled "A Question of Respect," girls and women who wanted to be shielded from the crudeness and coarseness to which boys and men were accustomed used to learn to protect themselves against it by comporting themselves in a socially refined manner with a strict moral code. And it was their job to communicate that with both behavior and speech, if needed. It was understood that if a gal didn't behaviorally separate herself from those crude and coarse conditions, and if needed, reinforce that verbally, she was accepting that she would be exposed to them. It probably wasn't an ideal situation for either sex because it still involved a pedestal for women and a lot of obligation for men. What women knew as respect was a form of veneration. However, in order to expect men to fulfill their end of that social contract, women had to at least be accountable for fulfilling theirs. Feminists spent the last century opposing that, and now it's not typical for women to be expected to separate ourselves from crudeness or coarseness, but we're also not granted socially enforced immunity from exposure to those conditions, either. For some reason, most women understand the first half of that, but not the second. And it's especially confusing to women who live by what's left of society's traditional family values. In other words, traditionally, women who wanted to be treated like ladies were expected to at least be ladies. Gentlemen treated women like ladies because they valued feminine gentility, morality, and compassion. Those conditions were maintained among women through a system of strict personal accountability, which is pretty much gone now. Modern women have, for all intents and purposes, abandoned that accountability and erased gentility and compassion as aspects of mature adult femininity, a decision feminists made for us as part of their fight over the past century to free women, and only women, from oppressive gender roles. Of course, they still expect men to offer their labor and self-sacrifice to shield women from the consequences of their increased spectrum of socially acceptable choices. While men have little or no exposure to feminine gentility, morality, and compassion to repay with masculine gentility, morality, and compassion, most modern women expect it anyway. They'll use the dogma of their socio-political belief systems to argue for it and to excuse reacting violently when their feminine sensibilities are offended. Where neo-traditionalist conservatism overlaps with feminism, then, is in an expectation that women and girls be treated like ladies, even if they act like bar wenches, and the belief that they should feel entitled to react violently when their aristocratic sense of entitlement to reverence for their social position is not accommodated. Imagine how they would react to such entitlement if it were expressed by men and boys. This week, Judith Shar joins HBR Talk to discuss the EV magazine slap threat and responses and the evolution of the surrounding gynocentric narratives. The discussion streams on multiple platforms. You can tune in to the live stream via the link in the low bar or find other viewing and listening options on HoneyBadgerBrigade.com. Also, please help us get past violent social media throttling over offended political sensibilities by liking and sharing this video.